Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elham Sabri, and I'm really delighted to serve as moderator for this session. On behalf of Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, NERPS at Hiroshima University, I warmly welcome you to the 42nd NERPS webinar series and 154th IDEC Institute seminars titled Textile Terrains, Exposing Environmental Impacts of Global Secondhand Clothing, Trade for Peace, Justice, and Sustainability. NERPS is an interdisciplinary platform that brings together researchers, educators, and practitioners to explore the connection between peace and sustainability. Through this webinar series, we aim to deepen discussion on global challenge, including environmental change, social inequalities, governance, and technological transformation. The series also contributes to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDGs 16, which focus on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our very, very great speakers, Professor Alice Payne and Dr. Alice Lewis, and our honorable discussants, Dr. Yassi Samii, who will lead us through today's session. Dr. Samii is a postdoctoral fellow and educator at RMIT University's Faculty of School of Fashion and Textiles. Here, Dr. Yassi, the floor is yours. We are so excited about our conversation. Go ahead, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elham. Thank you for your hard work and patience organizing this session. We are very happy and very honored to join you all today. My name is Yassi, and I am here today with my amazing colleagues, excellent scholars, Professor Alice Payne and Dr. Alice Lewis. So Professor Alice Payne is Dean of the School of Fashion and Textiles at RMIT. Her research focuses on environmental and social sustainability issues throughout the life cycle of clothing. Recent work has examined labor issues in the cotton value chain, technologies to address the problem of textile waste, consumer practices for circularity and circular design. Alice was part of the Australian Fashion Council-led consortium who designed the National Clothing Product Stewardship Scheme in Australia. She is author of the book Designing Fashion's Future, co-editor of Global Perspectives on Sustainable Fashion, and is an award-winning designer and educator. Dr. Alice Lewis is a landscape architecture educator and researcher at RMIT University, whose work explores material landscape legacies. Through design-led inquiry, architectural forensics, and speculative future-focused mapping and visualization, her research reveals how extractive industries, consumer culture, and global systems of trade and waste leave lasting physical, ecological, cultural, and political impacts on landscapes. Her teaching and research investigate novel applications of landscape architectural knowledge in response to urgent planetary challenges and has exhibited and published internationally. We are joining you all today from Naarm or Melbourne in Australia, and before I hand it over to my colleagues, I would love to take a moment for acknowledgement of country. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waterways across Australia where we conduct our business. Thank you so much, and Professor Payne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Yassi, and thank you, Elham. It's such a pleasure to be joining you all today, and we're grateful for the opportunity to share our work. So, across the global south, a new kind of landscape is emerging. River channels, floodplains, and coastlines, once ecologically alive, are now layered with discarded garments. We call these in our project textile terrains. These are the material and spatial fallout of the dominant globalized fashion system, one that is built on oppressive colonial logics that assumes that some lands and communities can be sacrificed in support of consumer culture and economic growth. These terrains are real. They are visible in satellite imagery, in drone footage, and in the lives of those who work with them. Yet politically, these terrains and the global flows of secondhand clothing that produce them remain invisible and obscured. And without visibility, there can be no accountability. So our research project, Textile Terrains, seeks to change that. We are an interdisciplinary team from RMIT University, working across fashion, law, and landscape architecture. And our work combines forensic research, spatial documentation, and visual storytelling to expose and legitimize the global flows of secondhand clothing and these hidden landscapes of waste. So by documenting these material flows, and we'll share them with you today, we aim to support policy reform, trade regulation, and extended producer responsibility. In other words, holding producers accountable for the full life cycle of the products they create. So how do these landscapes arise? To set the scene, we will start with a systems view of fashion overproduction. Clothing is a product of global value chains, and these begin with raw fiber production, whether from farm or forest or oil fields, then to the manufacturing of yarn, textiles and garments, through to the marketing by brands and retailers, the consumption and purchase by the wearer, and then its wearing as an item of clothing. Now, typically, brands and retailers are the most powerful actors in this value chain. And increasingly, brands and retailers are required to take responsibility for human rights and environmental issues upstream in this value chain, in other words, in all those production phases. However, once the garment has been sold to a consumer, the journey downstream, past the retail shop, becomes atomized. And the responsibility now lies with the individual wearer to keep this garment in use as long as possible and to find a suitable end-of-life pathway to keep it out of landfill. Now, problematically, garment production has been growing rapidly. And in the case of Australia, where we are based, it's 55 new items per person per year are imported into the country. This means that Australian wardrobes are swelling year upon year, and this excess clothing must go somewhere. Now, while there's some textile recycling, chiefly it is reuse or it is landfill, but the chief downstream pathways beyond that point of wearing. Now, to address this challenge, because Australia is not alone here, policymakers around the world look to circular economy initiatives that seek to slow the flow of materials. That might be encouraging garment longevity through design, influencing consumers to buy less, to repair, and so on, or to close the loop, to stimulate greater recycling of textiles and bring materials into new products rather than have them go to waste. And one of the mechanisms for this, which we'll touch more upon throughout the presentation, is extended producer responsibility, or EPR. And this follows the polluter pays principle. It asks producers, i.e. the clothing brands and retailers, to contribute to that downstream cost of managing the end of life of their products. While EPR schemes are now emerging in many countries and established in some, the amount of textiles being produced and consumed continues to grow far faster than policy can keep up. So what happens at present once the garment leaves the wearer? Here in Australia, while we have 220,000 tonnes of clothing going to landfill each year, which is a lot of clothing to landfill, a further 100,000 tonnes are donated via charity bins, donation depots, and they make space for the next wave of consumption. It's this downstream fate of this donated clothing that we're examining particularly in this project. Of this 100,000 tonnes, about 1/3 of the donations are resold locally in secondhand stores, but the majority are exported and then they enter a vast transnational trade network. Now, Australia is not unique. Other wealthy, high-consuming nations such as the US, UK, France, and Germany also export large amounts of donated secondhand clothing. The exported clothing is sold by the kilo, and then it moves into sorting hubs where it is graded, baled, and on-sold by weight. The lowest grades are shipped to Africa, Asia, and South America, and this is in volumes that far exceed local demand. In Ghana, for example, according to the GIZ, the country receives some 79 shipping containers of secondhand clothing each week, which is roughly 10 million garments. It is estimated that a large proportion, perhaps up to 40% of these items, may be waste upon arrival. And this is a critical part. When we say waste, we mean that while these secondhand clothing items may theoretically still be wearable, they're unsellable due to poor quality, they're inappropriate to the season, perhaps they're damaged, or they're simply in such excessive volumes that while wearable, no one wishes to buy them. So put simply, waste is something that no one attributes value to and therefore discards. Without the adequate infrastructure or regulatory oversight, this imported waste has nowhere to go. These unsellable garments might be dumped in open spaces available to the importing communities, whether along riverbanks or beaches, where textile waste accumulates, breaks down, infiltrates natural systems, and forms these hazardous formations we call textile terrains. So our research project has a series of objectives. First of all, we wish to understand and document these secondhand clothing pathways. Second, we want to understand who are the key agents involved and what are the main clothing flows. And third, we aim to qualify and spatially document these emerging waste landscapes. And these objectives guided us to track the secondhand clothing system across 3 interconnected scales. First, global trade flows, second, the pathways, and third, site-scale landscapes. And this multi-level perspective allowed us, the project, to move from system to network to landscape, connecting those global trade processes to local environmental outcomes. And each stage builds upon the next one. And they reveal how clothing moves through infrastructures of exchange before then accumulating in specific places. So I'll now pass on to my colleague, Dr. Alice Lewis, to share more about our methods.
Thank you, Alice. So to undertake this research, we began by assembling the interdisciplinary Textile Terrains research group, which is a group that brings together researchers from across RMIT universities, areas of fashion and textiles, landscape architecture, and law. And this interdisciplinary approach is really essential in this project because the complexity of the secondhand clothing system and its effects cannot really be addressed by a single discipline. So by combining our diverse expertise, we're really able to examine that system from multiple perspectives, which allows the research to operate across design, trade, policy, and environmental justice, which all appear within this system. Connecting all of these different points really allows us to understand how the intimate scale of clothing donation practices really sits within broader and links with broader globalized conditions of transnational trade, waste landscapes, and distributed environmental impacts. So methodologically, we adopt an approach of forensic spatial analysis to investigate the global secondhand clothing system. And by this, we mean a mode of inquiry that treats publicly available and originally generated material as evidence and triangulates multiple information sources to reconstruct how secondhand clothing moves and, importantly, where it accumulates. So in this process, we combine 3 main techniques. The first is open source investigation, where we draw on publicly available material, including shipping records, NGO reports, scientific research, social media, and investigative journalism to trace actors, supply chains, and key points of opacity within the secondhand clothing trading system. Secondly, we worked through trade data analysis, where we worked with harmonized trade statistics and customs classifications to quantify the scale and direction of secondhand clothing flows and to identify key exporting and importing countries and regions. And thirdly was spatial mapping, where we mapped these flows and their reported endpoints in order to visualize how global circulation operates and how the emergence of textile terrains is embedded within this system. So this approach really responds to limitations of official data and consolidated data in these areas, as well as to the positionality of conducting this research from Australia. So we're cognizant that we're really working at a distance. And so for this research, we were focusing primarily on global flows, distributions, and environmental impacts, while remaining careful not to assume local knowledge about how these landscapes are really lived and governed. But together, these methods allow us to piece together fragmented information and make visible the often obscured infrastructural and environmental impacts and flows of the secondhand clothing trade. The project spans 3 parts, as we've said, and I'll hand back to Professor Alice Payne to explain the first parts.
Thank you, Alice. So the first stage maps the international geography of the secondhand clothing trade. And for this, we use publicly available trade data, specifically the International Trade Centre Trade Map data from 2024, which is the harmonised system, the HS Trade Code 6309, which is worn clothing and other articles. And by tracking that, we were able to spatialise this information and really reveal the major exporting and importing regions and the global redistribution networks that link the consumption of clothing in high consuming countries with the resale markets in the importing countries. So here's an example of one of those maps, and this is one of the maps that situates Australia within this system, examining its role in exporting used clothing and the broader networks that the garments then enter. So in this map, you can see that the secondhand clothing leaves Australia chiefly for destinations in the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia and Pakistan, with smaller flows to other nations such as the Pacific Islands. Now, a close-up of 2 other countries shows their contribution to the trade. So on the left, you can see the map we have of the United States. This is the #1 exporter of secondhand clothing in the world, and a high consumer of new clothing by population. And you'll notice those really thick lines, particularly going of secondhand clothing flowing to Guatemala and to Chile. Now, on the right is Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is also a major player in the secondhand clothing trade. They're a major trader, however, rather than a high-consuming country. And you can see that the way the inflows come in and then they go out again. So Pakistan is one of a series of nations that act as sorting hubs for the trade, with the UAE and Malaysia also on this list as importing and exporting large quantities of secondhand clothing. Now, what becomes quite exciting is when you start to overlay all this trade data, all these different maps, and we have quite a number of these maps that we built. When you overlay them, you can vividly see the passage of secondhand clothing as it circulates about the globe. Now, what is very noticeable in this map is that you can really see the dominance of clear starting points in the industrial high-consuming nations, the passage of that secondhand clothing into sorting hubs, and then its destination as endpoints, chiefly across the global south, particularly in Asia and South America. And the map really reveals how these countries serve as repositories for so much exported secondhand clothing, with a lot of inflow going into those countries and very little outflow. We now turn to the second stage of our research, and this is where we looked in more detail at those pathways to trace and to visualize how garments move through that secondhand clothing system, from steps in donation and collection through to sorting, export, import, resale, and disposal. And mapping these pathways allowed us to identify the key actors, the infrastructures involved, and what's really interesting is how the garments shift in value along the supply chain that's created. And our research really highlighted the opacity of this system. So garments are passing through multiple intermediaries and origin points, and that makes them very difficult to trace. And so to create these visuals, we chiefly looked at academic papers and scientific reports. So this is the first one, and in this case, we're taking Australia as the case point of the beginning pathway. And this first map shows the pathways that donated worn clothing can take after they enter Australia's collection systems. So it shows here a branching value chain, which is shaped by the garment quality, the condition, the fibre composition, the branding, its seasonality, all these different attributes that contribute to how it's valued in its next life. These factors are just some. They'll determine whether the donated items are resold locally, whether they're downcycled into rags, whether they're exported for international reuse or discarded to landfill. So that wearer up in the top corner, they decide first, is it reusable? Is it waste? If it's waste, it goes to landfill. If it's reusable, depending on quality, it could be resold, donated, sent to some recycling or to rags. So once collected, it moves into these sorting facilities, and it's often assessed in the back room of charity shops. And sorters have to make really rapid decisions about saleability, often under time pressure with limited information, really thinking about the store that they want to place it in or whether it's suitable for an export market. So those high quality items or suitable for Australian consumers are directed to domestic resale through op shops and online charity platforms. The rest, which is in fact the majority, are bundled and they're sold by the kilo to commercial exporters. Now, the UN Comtrade data suggests that the volume of worn clothing traded globally has increased almost sevenfold over the past 3 decades. Yet alongside, this in itself represents only 10 to 20% of the total volume of clothing being traded internationally. So really, the challenge we have here is there's simply so much of it. So the next stop for clothing, once it's exported from Australia, is it's often exported directly to a specialised sorting hub. And as you saw in phase 1, there are a number of key countries that play this role as intermediaries in this trade. And a key example is sorting facilities in Malaysia, in the UAE, and Pakistan, as well as others. And these are commercial facilities, and they import mixed bales, which they'll then resort by type and for different markets, like it might be women's shirts or men's pants, and then they'll reclassify. At these sorting hubs, garments are first separated into more homogenous clothing categories like shirts or trousers, outerwear, and so on. And then this categorization reduces that variability and allows buyers to then purchase clothing suited to different market demands. The items will be graded by quality, condition, perceived resale value, and then each grade gets a different price point. And it's this grading that's really central to how value is assigned within the secondhand clothing trade. So the reports and literature we reviewed really highlighted that the high quality garments, the so-called A grade or the cream, are sent on to high consuming countries for resale, while the lower C grade items are often exported to countries across the global south, whether in Africa, South America, or elsewhere. And this means that those nations are receiving lower quality stock than the wealthy nations who have more purchasing power. So through these processes, sorting hubs act as these key decision-making nodes within the global worn clothing value chain, and they shape both the economic value of the garments as well as their geographic destination. Now the garments have landed in their destination point. In this case, we've traced the local value chain of secondhand clothing in Ghana. The bales of used garments arrive primarily through the port of Tema before being transported by truck to Kantamanto Market in central Accra, the largest secondhand clothing trading hub in West Africa. Here, importers sell the bales to retailers who open and sort them into categories 1 to 4, which is based on quality and sale potential. The best garments will be resold, while the lower quality items often become waste, the category 4 particularly. Almost all clothes coming into this market will go through some form of transformation, whether polishing, ironing, dyeing, altering, screen printing. And this ecosystem is a vibrant network of workers, whether it's head porters, alteration specialists, dyers, and cleaners. And on the one hand, while this secondhand clothing trade creates livelihoods and economic opportunities, it also generates significant environmental and social impacts. The clothes that cannot be sold will become waste, with some estimates suggesting up to 40% of imported secondhand clothing takes this route. In Cantonmento market, there are 6 identified waste pathways, the top 3 being official waste collection, burning around the market, and then open dumping. So official collectors will transport mixed market waste to designated landfill sites, and then private collectors potentially may dump surplus unsellable clothes in the unofficial sites, and that's where textile waste accumulates, forming these hazardous terrains as it infiltrates local environments. I'll now pass back to Alice.
Thank you. So in this third part of the project, we shifted scale to examine the reported presence of textile terrains across Accra in Ghana. And at this stage, the research really focuses on spatializing information drawn from news reporting, NGO documentation, and scientific studies to better understand how unsold secondhand clothing can accumulate beyond resale markets. In this process, we explore how these garments combine with other waste streams to form distinct and environmentally hazardous landscape typologies. So in our study, we examined the distribution in this particular one. We examined the distribution and presence of textile waste in Old Fadama, which is an informal settlement housing around 80,000 residents situated between the eastern bank of the Odo River, which you can just see on the one of the images there, and Cantonmento market, which is the market we studied in the previous phase. We specifically focused on this area as it's widely reported as being a key unofficial dumping ground for unsellable clothing from Cantonmento, with The Guardian reporting a mountain of textile waste some 20 metres high. Here we're using satellite imaged and collected drone footage, which was captured in February of 2025, to really study these claims and see what was happening here. So we found that the primary waste accumulation closely aligns with the site's main topographic feature, forming a distinct raised landform, so that the mountainous terrain situated both between the dwellings of Old Fadama and the very edge of the Odo River. And to investigate this further, we generated a point cloud surface model from our drone footage, and this allowed us to reconstruct high-resolution topography in an area where reliable elevation data was not otherwise publicly available. And you can see that in the video on the slide there. This analysis shows that prolonged informal waste deposition has produced a significant hilly terrain, and the mound, by our measurements, reached 18 metres above the water level of Odo River at that time, so taking into account that the river level does fluctuate. And so this remains then consistent with what was being reported in the news sources. In understanding the content of the mound, we explored reporting and field observations that indicate that while textiles are certainly present, the mound at Old Fadama is composed of multiple waste streams, and that includes household refuse from the surrounding settlement, organic waste from a nearby fresh produce market, plastics, textiles, and notably e-waste as well. And so while these materials are deposited in an ongoing and mixed condition, shifts in regional waste management, such as the closure of nearby dump sites, and potentially also the rise of import of different goods, are reported to alter the types and proportions of waste that are deposited and entering and depositing on site. So over time, we predict that this would produce a form of informal stratification, which we've represented here, though we also acknowledge that continual deposition and the redistribution activities from waste picking, e-waste mining, and other labour sources as well as livestock that inhabit the site would prevent the formation of really clearly defined layers. This detailed asymmetric view has been useful in really allowing us to understand how the old Fadama dump site is situated between what we call two critical and potentially hazardous adjacencies. So one is the densely inhabited informal settlement and the dwellings, and the other is the active edge of the Odo River. So residents really live then in immediate proximity of decomposing waste, leachate, and residues with no clear spatial separation. And this lack of containment would then allow the waste and its hazards to infiltrate the zone of human inhabitation. And on the river edge, the waste mound directly meets the water, so river flow and seasonal flooding can then erode the mound, transporting waste downstream into the Coral Lagoon, which sits just below this study site, and ultimately into the ocean. So this process of visualization across all three parts of the project really enabled us to consolidate the fragmented information and data into visualizations that begin to tell the story of how secondhand clothing moves through the global system. And importantly, the research demonstrates that secondhand clothing does not always circulate as reuse, but enters a complex, or can enter a complex transnational trade network and contributes to the emergence of textile waste landscapes in importing communities with the potential to infiltrate and impact the surrounding ecosystems. And with that, I'll hand back to Alice Payne to talk about the impacts of that.
Thank you, Alice. So thinking about the implications of what you've just heard and what we have visualized through these multiple perspectives, as we've really shown, tracing these pathways and mapping the global flows, it can help connect distant consumption practices with their environmental outcomes that might be very far apart geographically. Visualizing these landscapes then can contribute to broader discussions about responsibility, about governance, and about regulation in global textile systems. Now, the diagram that we have here shows the idealized circular economy, and it's one in which products and materials can circulate at highest and best use, and waste to landfill is avoided through recycling. However, most circular economy policies, a diagram like this or one similar is commonly used across many different examples of a circular textiles economy. These policies are framed at national or at regional levels, and so they do not consider adequately the transnational flow of textile waste beyond single country borders. They also don't consider how this sort of global flows contribute to value creation as well as value destruction elsewhere in the world. So our findings really point to critical gaps in this thinking between where responsibility is legislated and where the waste materializes. Now, a key policy, as I flagged earlier, to support a circular economy, extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is one in which producers pay a levy on the items they produce, and then that levy supports the activities that can create the circular economy that you can see in the picture. However, it doesn't extend beyond the jurisdictions where it's implemented. So the producers in high consumption countries, they remain accountable only within their own borders, even as the surplus products that generate waste, their products, generate this waste half a world away. In other words, responsibility stops at the border. A second point that's worth flagging is that under international waste regulation, particularly the Basel Convention, textiles are not formally recognised as a waste stream. And they do sit in an ambiguous place where, as long as they have value, they can be sold, and therefore they're not waste if they're not discarded. Yet what we've seen and what we've shown through our tracking and through the landscapes that we've visualised is that they become waste in place. This legal blind spot allows exporting countries to frame the trade as solely for reuse or charity, even though the material outcome is disposal as well as reuse. So it's not as simple as it would appear. Third, our research process has demonstrated the need for ongoing reciprocal communication with the communities who live and work in this terrain. Visibility must be two-way, not just ourselves as researchers observing, of course, but systems of exchange that allow communities to articulate their own priorities and needs. And again, in the circular economy framing, popular particularly in the global north, this is a blind spot. And finally, these insights really point towards the need for an adaptive accountability. We have systems that are under transition at the moment, and there's more positive things happening each day, even as the amount of clothing produced continues to grow. So the systems that we develop collaboratively must remain connected to the realities on the ground, and they need to be capable of evolving in response to them, rather than continuing to externalize harm as what's currently happening. So together, these lessons really show that addressing textile waste is not only a matter of material management, but it's one of justice, recognition, and responsibility. So what does it look like in actuality, and what would kind of a more just system potentially look like? So first of all, it's important to note that in a globalized system, we can never really have a perfect circle as we'd like to imagine in a kind of industrial ecology model of circular economy. So we do need to recognize that these flows are, they're moving constantly. They have particular regions and specializations. They're truly global. And so while EPR is a really vital step forward in ensuring the polluter pays and ensuring that producers do take downstream responsibility for the waste their products cause, without a coordinated approach to EPR tracked through the whole system and with full transparency, there is a real risk that despite the promise of these EPR schemes, they will not succeed in reducing waste ultimately, and because instead they'll keep funneling matter to the end countries under the guise of reuse. So an approach that is emergent is one of ultimate producer responsibility. And this is coming from researchers who work in e-waste particularly. And UPR is an emerging concept in which the levies raised from the producers paying EPR in different regions, these levies are not only distributed within the country they're collected in, but they're distributed to the global communities that are ultimately bearing the cost of the end-of-life impacts of these products. UPR would recognise and reward the service these communities are providing for the whole system and to help remediate the damage they're causing as well. So in sum, for high-consuming countries, particularly like Australia, there also needs to be greater attention paid to the volume of new clothing being placed on the market each year. It's, again, we can't have this neat circle if we don't actually tackle the rising amount of clothing flowing into the system as new clothing to begin with. So really at the beginning of pipe solution is where we need to look to as well. And that might be policy levers to slow and reduce the flow of new material. And these will be essential to avoiding the greater buildup of secondhand clothing at the end of, or towards the end of the life cycle. So in sum, we are so pleased to have been able to share this research with you today, and we really wish to hear your perspectives and hear your questions and thoughts on where the next steps could take us. So we do encourage you to reach out with any questions and feedback, and of course we now look forward to the discussion that follows. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Payne and Dr. Lewis. Oh, I see we do have one question. Dahlia, also, would you like to turn your mic on and ask the question yourself? Although it's actually a lovely comment, thank you, rather than a question. But we would love to hear from you. In case anyone has a question, please do feel free to turn your mics on and ask the question. Dalia has said, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I'm interested in learning more about the role of local communities who are directly affected by secondhand clothing trade and waste in the ideal circular economy model.
I suppose we can provide some comment on that, I suppose. So what we've seen and what our research revealed, not only from a desktop perspective, but also for our colleagues from Ghana and also colleagues within Ghana, is just how, I guess, lively and innovative the work that is happening in the markets are. We touched upon some of the innovations around circularity and remanufacturing that they're employing to create value from these low value items. And there's so much that can be learned and shared across the world of the innovations in this space. I guess we can also reflect on the impact on the place that I'm based in Australia, where we can see craft communities who work with making, using the handmade, keeping materials in use for longer through, I guess, that care and attention and really respecting the materials that come in. And that has intrinsic value. Perhaps it's not always captured economically, and certainly in the face of low-cost, fast-fashion clothing, it can be problematic. But there are numerous benefits to communities. There clearly needs to be far greater investment, though, and an economic recognition of the work that they're doing. I don't know, Alice, if you wanted to add to that.
I think there was a really great summary, and the only thing that I was going to add was what you picked up on at the end, is that what we've really discovered, and I think it was really also highlighted through a panel discussion we ran that invited different stakeholders from Australia and as well as from Ghana in to have a conversation about this work, was just how vital every member along this whole chain is in making the movement of clothing possible. And so I think circularity models, it can be easy to, there's such a diverse forms of work and labor around all of this that it can be easy to miss some of them. But as Alice says, there's such incredible innovation and happening, and all of these individuals, the roles that they play, the tasks that they play, from Australia through sorting hubs, from high consumption countries through sorting hubs to end markets, that are absolutely vital in making this system work. So yeah, remembering them, I think, is the key.
Thank you. Oh, a second question. Thank you so much, both. Great and comprehensive, and this is from Letitia. Thank you, Letitia. Great and comprehensive work. Thank you for your presentation. Can you expand on the UPR, how they could be materialized from the side of the importers?
Thank you, Letitia. And it is a great question. It's one that I don't yet know the answer to. And the reason for that is that UPR is still very much an emerging concept. As I mentioned, there was a great paper which we can share in the chat. Actually, I'll get the reference for you, from 2023, which was looking particularly at e-waste and proposing UPR as an approach to ensure that the e-waste can be effectively handled in the destination countries where it often might end up. And in terms of how it could be materialized, it really will require a coordinated effort. And my hopes would be that the European Union, because they're already putting in EPR in individual countries, it's a requirement in the EU, and some already have EPR and some more are coming. There really needs to be, I guess, a coordinated approach where possible to really highlight this issue and highlight that, for example, if 80% of what you're collecting in the country goes offshore, as indeed it does in some countries, well then surely 80% of the levies raised should also go offshore. I mean, perhaps that's a bit simplistic, but really it highlights that there's a blind spot in the EPR thinking if we're not putting this concept forward.
Thank you so much, Alice. And we have another question from Anne. Thank you so much for the enlightening research on the unexpected negative impact of international secondhand clothing trade. I would like to ask for developing countries' policies in banning the imports of secondhand clothing, such as the case of Vietnam, and the limits or possible improvements of these policies against secondhand clothing trade.
Yes, that's a good question, Anne. And there's many different reasons why countries might ban or limit the imports of secondhand clothing. And in some cases, we do know it's about the dignity of that country as well. Do they really need to have the discards coming through and then the waste that it generates later? Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. I'm not familiar with the case of Vietnam particularly, so I couldn't comment. But what I would say is that we mustn't lose sight of the big picture, which is there's simply far too much clothing being produced at the front end. And because there's so much being produced at the front end, we have a situation where countries rightly want to ban the import of secondhand clothing because, there's already enough new clothing coming in. So I feel there probably needs to be a bigger conversation about what is the right amount of clothing we produce as a world, but I don't know how we coordinate such a question. I don't know, Alice, if you wanted to add on to that.
Just maybe to also call out something that we always to and fro within our research, but along with some of the environmental hazards and the saturation of local markets and things that the secondhand clothing trade takes, it also does now play a vital part in a lot of local and national economies and things. So it's in terms of it's sort of not all bad either, and how we can sensitively go about that, around conversations about quantity, about quality, those sorts of things, rather than just a yes imports or no imports, I think is a really essential step in this process, because it does sustain a lot of people in terms of their livelihoods and give access to cheap clothing alternatives and all sorts of things. So it's an incredibly complex space. Just the point that I'd like to highlight.
Thank you. There is time for one more question if anyone has a burning question. Yeah, seems to be it seems like that was all the questions that we had. So yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the session. Elham, I was wondering if you want to have any final remarks.
Thank you so much for your great explanation on Textile Terrains. It was really insightful for everyone. And also, I really appreciate your valuable contribution and important perspective on this very important and timely issue and responsibility in the context of second-hand clothing trade. Actually, if you want to add something else as a discussion to the session, I would appreciate it. You can add it, or if you have any other material and issue you can bring to this session, I would appreciate you add. Or if not, we can close the session. I think that we don't have any question anymore so far.
Thank you. No, I think we are very grateful for this opportunity. This is a research we started last year, and we would love to emphasize that it's not black and white, as we mentioned. All of these challenges need to be acknowledged, but we also need adaptive systems suitable for the countries who are importing and exporting, a dialogue and acknowledgement of all the positive and the negative sides. And we also would really love to hear from the audience here and, what is their research, their perspective, and also what they thought of this research. So do please reach out with your questions and suggestions, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you so much. And we have another question. Dr. Leticia asked about any ideas for the follow-up studies. If there will be any answer for that, we appreciate it.
Oh.
Do you want to go, Alice, and share some of the discussions we've had, or
Yes, I can say a few of them. So I think really through this work, a few kind of key things emerged, and one was the building of a methodology that really allows us to track and to trace these pathways. So we are keen to continue that. We looked at Ghana and specifically in this project, but there are many countries across the world that are focusing, in the same situation and have similar comparable scenarios. So that's one sort of stream of interest, is really this: how can documenting and visualizing and adding spatial data to particular places really assist in our conversations about them, and then go hopefully to informing policy or informing those conversations about EPR. Another one too, which we're quite excited about, is just in doing this research, of course, we always see other aspects of it. And so really understanding the complexity of the labor chains along this process, and moving through processes of presencing this labor in all of the different countries, I think is a really important, we as a group think is a really important facet. So we're also exploring that. Other future immediate things that I have on the top of my head, but Alice and Yassi might, if there's anything to add to that.
Oh, it's a good summary. It is a transferable methodology, and I do think there's so much more to uncover.
Absolutely. I just want to echo that. It's for me, coming from a different discipline, the methodology was the most fascinating and very inviting. So
I've just seen there's another question that's come into the chat. Do we know roughly what percentage of volumes being exported to developing countries are sorted for resale before being shipped? So I think, in the pathways that we looked at, they were all sorted to varying degrees, often multiple times before being shipped into the importing country. But we also know there's a lot of diversity in terms of how this happens. Sometimes in different countries, it might be directly exported from the high consumption country directly to an end market. But often there's these large intermediaries. We don't know what percentage, unless, Alice, you may have thoughts there. It seems to me the majority is probably sorted, isn't it?
It seems to be the majority, but this is one of the key points of opacity within these chains. It's very easy to find the exporting statistics or the data around export quantity, but as soon as things go into individual businesses for resorting and things like that, it's very, very difficult to trace. So at the moment, we've really looked at just the exporting data, and everything else just goes off in a way similar kind of information that we've been able to come up with, which is suggestive of majority, but not a definitive truth.
Thank you so much for your explanation. And again, thank you very much, Professor Alice Payne and Dr. Alice and Dr. Yossi. It's really great honor to have you on our NERPS platform today. And I would also like to thank all participants today for joining us and for their engagements. This concludes our 40 seconds NERPS webinar. We hope to see you soon again in our future session. Please do not forget to follow us in our social media. Soon we will publish this incredible webinar in our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone.